All right, let's get started for today. Thank you for joining us for our first session in this 10-part series on the Arab-Israeli conflict with Avi Ben-Hur. Today's session will focus on the background to the conflict, Jewish nationalism, the rise of the Zionist movement, Arab nationalism, and the rise of Palestinian nationalism movement. My name is Ellen Resnick, and I'm the Educational Outreach and Programs Manager at Classrooms Without Borders. Classrooms Without Borders works with over 138 schools in Pittsburgh, West Virginia, Ohio, and Florida. We offer travel study seminars for educators to Europe and Israel, professional development, in-school programming, curriculum support, and community events. We are able to bring inspiring programs to our community of learners free of charge because of your donations. If you wish to make a contribution to support our mission, please visit our website to donate online. We are who we are because of the support of individuals like you. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our scholar for today, our scholar in residence, Avi Ben-Hur. Avi has lectured, taught, and facilitated workshops in the United States, Warsaw, Prague, Berlin, and Greece. From 1996 to 2000, Avi taught in Yad Vashem's International School for Holocaust Studies. And as a guide, Avi has specialized in working with organizations focusing on political issues, interfaith programs, and Holocaust studies. We welcome any questions you might have. Please use the chat feature to message your questions directly to Avi Ben-Hur. Avi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ellen. Good afternoon, everybody. Just reminding you, I'm speaking to you from Jerusalem, and it is 9 o'clock or 9:04 in the evening. So welcome, everybody. So you understand we're beginning a 10-part series on the conflict, which may sound like a lot, but it's actually not. And I hope everybody understands that this is kind of a primer or primer to the conflict, as designed primarily for teachers that may want to integrate it into their classrooms. That's the primary purpose. I just want to let you guys know that. So some of you are coming here with a lot of knowledge and may feel that this is a little bit, it's not deep enough for you, and others are not coming with knowledge and will be filled by this, but I think everyone will get something out of it. And of course, we're going to have a significant section of Q&A at the end, so people also get to broaden the scope and deepen the conversation. So let us begin with your permission. Just take a look for a moment, if you will, on the map in front of you, and please note all of the various Muslim/Arab countries, for the most part. And you see that little blue dot in the middle, it's Israel. So really, when we talk about the Arab-Israeli conflict, we're looking at a tiny, tiny country, Israel, surrounded by mostly, but today not all, mostly quite hostile and enemy states. Now, one of the things that I think is not obvious to many of us, and I want to put it on the table right now, is a basic question is, has there been an historic conflict between Jews and Arabs? I mean, have Jews and Arabs been at each other's throats for a really, really long time? And the answer is no. There isn't any deep historic hostility or enmity between Jews and Arabs. I'm talking about going back 1,300 years. There's no huge clash between Judaism and Islam. I mean, there's no great love either, but there's no great clash. This is not similar to, let's say, Christianity and Judaism, which were competing faiths 2,000 years ago, and it's not the same as Christianity and Islam that clashed also violently civilizationally. It's not the case in terms of Judaism and Islam. In fact, I'll just say in brackets and parentheses, perhaps the greatest Jewish philosopher in history, in Jewish history, and I'm speaking now about the Rambam or Maimonides, basically wrote unequivocally that Islam is an authentic monotheistic faith, okay, which he didn't have the same to say about Christianity. So I'm saying that to you, not that, again, that the Jews and Islam are very close, but you also don't have the same kind of inherent structural antagonism that you do between Judaism and Christianity and Islamic Christianity. And finally here, one of the focal points, foci of deep tension and conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, between Jews and Muslims, is the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, or the Haram Sharif, as the Muslims would call it. And you may be surprised to hear that you did not have a millennial conflict between Jews and Arabs, or Jews and Muslims, I should say, over that site. The conflict over the site actually begins in the late 20th century, which may sound shocking to some of you because it's such a focal point today. Now, how long has the conflict been going on? You always read things about, oh, it's been going on for hundreds of years, 1,000 years, 2,000. So guys, maximum, okay, the maximum way of looking at it is 140 years. And I'll explain that in a moment. And at a minimum, it's 101 years. How does that maximum work? 1881, actually, I should say 1882. 1882 is the year that the first Zionists set foot in the land of Israel. In other words, Jews who came to the land of Israel, to Palestine, before 1882, did not come for nationalistic reasons. They didn't come to build a modern nation state, okay? And therefore, we can't talk about a national conflict between Jews and Arabs in the land of Israel before you have a consciousness of some kind of nationalism and a national conflict. So at the earliest, we can talk about 1881 or 1882. The problem is, in 1882, there's a Jewish national consciousness. Is there a Palestinian Arab national consciousness? The answer is no, and we're going to get to that. We'll understand that later on today. So my opening shot here is 1881, although I'll be honest with you, my personal take, my academic take is that we really should have the starting point in 1920, and you'll understand why, I think, by the end of today's session, or certainly at the opening shot of our next session in a month's time. So maximum it's going on 140 years, and minimally it's going on for 101 years. For sure, in 1920 we have the first movement or international. We're having the first violence. Okay, it's based on nationalism between the two sides in 1920. Then we can put our finger on it for sure. And it's not to say there wasn't violence before that, but I'll argue that it wasn't. The violence before that was not based on nationalism. Okay, now let's take this to a different plane entirely. Because the conflict's been going on, let's say, for a minimum of 101 years, we would expect to see a lot of people being killed on both sides. And here you have a very approximate number here, or numbers here. And those who are interested in knowing how I came to approximation, I actually, 2 years ago, in 2017, I went through a lot of data and stats and came up with a number of casualties from 1947, the beginning of Israel's war for independence, until 2017. Okay, and the number there was like something like 130 something. And what I've done is, in the last 4 years, I've added a few thousand for all kinds of reasons I'm not going to go into right now. So it's maximum 140,000 people have been killed in this conflict on both sides in 101 years. Okay, of whom about 110,000 are Arabs and about 30,000 are Jews. Okay, again, if these numbers appear to be too small, the official number, Israel's official number of people having been killed, Israelis having been killed, not Jews, Israelis, because Israeli Druze, for example, DRUZ, also served in the Israeli army and have died in this conflict on our side of the conflict. So the number that we have in Israel, and you can all look it up, of how many people, like last Memorial Day, it was something, I think, like 25,000 or something like that. Okay, so I'm saying that to you because that's from they're taking that number, I think, from 1947 till today, and I've gone back a little bit further back in time and added other people who were killed in the conflict before there was a state of Israel, because those numbers relate to the state. So you're looking at a number, 140,000, where let's put this into some kind of context and proportions, right? So the so-called Syrian civil war, or I'm not sure civil war is the correct term, the war in Syria that has gone on at this point for about 11 years, 10, 11 years, has had at least 600,000 casualties. At least 600,000 people have been killed, and I think that's a low number. You take a war like, World War II, like almost on any given day, you had these kind of numbers of people being killed. Okay, World War One, another terrible war. In other words, what I'm trying to say is, every life is precious, but we tend it not we. I think that generally the world tends to overstate and blow way out of proportion the conflict. There is a conflict. There are wars. People get killed. But we look at the big picture. The big picture is a little over a century. A little over a century, this conflict, these are the numbers. And the numbers are big, but they're not, it's nothing like other major conflicts that we know in our lifetimes and before our lifetimes in the 20th century and in the early 21st century. And I think that what I'm saying is we need to put some proportions on this. There's a lot of emotions involved when we look at these numbers, but we have to look at things, I think, in a balanced kind of way, also in terms of the numbers themselves. So what is this conflict about and who are the participants? And this is what I'm putting in front of you right now is going to guide us, okay, in all 10 sessions, because all 5 of these concentric circles or layers that we have in front of us here are relevant for most of the period of conflict, not all of them. I would say that 3 out of the 5 have been there present from the get-go, and the other 2 have joined in later on. So let's take a look. So number 1, we're talking about 2 nations, Jews and Arabs, okay, who each have national movements that strive for self-determination, a nation state, and they are competing for the same real estate. They're competing for the same territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. Okay, we're talking about the Jewish National Movement, which would be the Zionist Movement, later on the State of Israel, and we're talking about the Palestinian National Movement, which is still the Palestinian National Movement. So this is layer number 1. Layer number 2, we have interstate rivalry. In other words, once we have a State of Israel, starting from the 14th of May, 1948, and is immediately invaded within 24 hours by 5 Arab states, we now have an interstate conflict. It's conflict not just between nations or national movements, but rather proper states with everything that entails. Okay, and there have been different partners is the wrong term. There have been different parties to this conflict facing Israel is Israel. Okay, but the Arab states, it has not always been in each war the same Arab states. So, for example, Lebanon participated in 48, but that was it. They didn't participate in 56, in 67, in 73, but then they're back again in 82. Okay, so Iraq participated in 48, Iraq participated to a certain extent in 67, and that was, and of course shot missiles at us in the first Gulf War. So it's not necessarily the same players. And Egypt's been, Jordan has stopped participating after 67. Egypt stopped participating after 73. Okay, because we have ultimately peace treaties with these countries, and so on and so forth. Okay, so we have here also interstate rivalry. Layer number 3, which may for some of you be the most obvious, but I'm going to argue that it's not. It's a latecomer, is a religious conflict between Jews and Muslims. I don't want to say Judaism and Islam. I think it's too big a statement, and I don't think it's correct. But between Jews and Muslims, okay, in other words, there is a certain layer to this conflict, which is a religious layer. And I will be arguing more session number 2 and not session number 1. Not today, but the next session, I will make the argument, and I will try to make a case that the religious layer did not have to play a significant part in this story, and that it is taken off in a big way, particularly after 1967. And it was deliberately introduced into the conflict at a certain point, which we're going to talk about in the next session, not this session. Okay, so we have this interreligious conflict. The 4th one, which is actually a relatively new one, but it takes prominence today. It's a relatively new one, but now it's maybe it is eclipsing to a certain extent many of the others, and that is a regional conflict between Sunni and Shiite Muslims who are fighting so-called moderate Sunni Arab states, aligning themselves and to a certain extent allying themselves with Israel, facing off against Shiite rivals, the most prominent of them, of course, being Iran, but not only Iran. Okay, and finally, another layer that's been there from the get-go has been what I'm calling great power competition. In simple English, this means for sure in 1948, it means in World War One, we're talking about the powers, European powers that participated, particularly the British and the French, Ottoman Turks, and so on and so forth, but particularly the British and the French. Post World War II, of course, we're talking about the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union, and that would mean 48, 56, 67, 73, okay? And the great powers still get involved and impact the conflict till today. You may be thinking a lot about the United States. Well, the United States is now beginning to pivot away dramatically from the region and from the conflict. But Russia is Putin's Russia is very, very involved in the conflict, is very proactive about it. And guess what? China is tiptoeing around and into this as well. And maybe the very last session we'll talk about where China might be going. So these are, to my mind, very important layers that are going to be accompanying us through most of the sessions. And it's going to be, to a certain extent, a prism through which we're going to be viewing the conflict. I have to say that starting from the next session, not this one, we're going to be dealing also with 3 more layers, which are going to be leadership on sides of the conflict. We're going to look at the regional level, okay, how it impacts different countries, different states that want to be hegemons in the region. And the third layer is going to be, of course, the great power competition in the Cold War. So we're going to be directly spotlighting those 3 layers as well as these. Okay, so ladies and gents, we really have to start off with nationalism, because if we're making the claim that at its most basic level, this conflict is a national conflict between 2 different groups that define themselves as nations and lay claim to the same territory, we need to ask ourselves a very important question, which is, what is nationalism and when did it rear its ugly head? Because I think we're going to agree that nationalism has been one of the most powerful forces in international relations for the last 200 plus years, okay? And both the Jewish national movement, which we're going to call Zionism later on, and the Palestinian National Movement are both part of nationalism. And one of the things that, especially for lay people who are not, maybe have not studied this and don't teach this, may not realize, nationalism is a very new ideology. It is not an ancient one. You can't project backwards nationalism to antiquity and not to the Middle Ages either. It's a very, very new concept. It's a concept that is a product of the European Enlightenment, okay, of the 18th century, and of all kinds of events that take place at the end of the 18th and beginning of 19th century, which we're going to be examining next few minutes. If you take a look in front of you, you note there is a very nice painting here of Garibaldi entering into Naples in 1860, and of course this is the just about the end of the reunification of Italy, and this is one of the big, emerging states. So there was no Italy as a state into the middle of the 19th century. There was no Germany until 1871. I just got muted for some reason. Countries take for granted, some of them are very new countries that really have arrived at our doorstep only in the mid or late 19th century. I want to talk about different types of nationalism, okay, before we even get into what's going to be sparking and spurring it, okay? So there are a lot of different types, but I want to focus on 2 major types of nationalism. The first one is known as civic nationalism or liberal nationalism. And the idea behind this nationalism is that people define themselves as a nation because they share a value system or they share an ideology, not because they're racially the same, not because they have the same language, not because they have the same history, not because they have the same folklore, not because they're the same ethnos or ethnic group or something like that. And not necessarily because of territory. They all share common values or ideology. And the reason I've put up here the US flag and kind of France divided into the French flag is because these are two good examples of what you call civic or liberal nationalism. If we want to ask ourselves, and I assume, although I shouldn't, that most of you are Americans, okay, they're sitting in front of me, okay, and we ask us, what brings to, I know I'm saying this is a very strange moment in American history right now, so I want to take you back maybe 10 years. So it's always such an argument that in 2021 we can't have this conversation, but what brings together a Chinese American, Italian American, a Jewish American, Polish American, African American, what have you? What's the commonality, okay, that is behind the American idea? And the answer, ladies and gentlemen, is they all accept the ideas of the Constitution, which means they share a common ideology or value system. Okay, it's based on the Constitution. The same thing with the French. The idea of French nationalism is also based on a value system. Okay, and we add liberal into this, so it means that there's a belief in equal political rights. Okay, that people have individual rights, equality, freedom. Okay, there's tolerance. These are the values that this kind of nationalism is predicated upon. It does not mean that they live up to the ideals necessarily, but these are the ideals that they put in front of themselves. This is something important to look at, because this kind of nationalism is not necessarily the majority of the cases, but it's a type of nationalism which is important, because when we look at Jewish nationalism or Zionism, I'm going to the end of the story, it perceives itself as a composite between this type of nationalism that I'm presenting here and the next one, okay, which is known as ethno-nationalism. And ethno-nationalism might be something that a lot of you are more familiar with. And please note, on the right-hand side, I put up two images. One of them is a structure in Russia. That entire dome is commemorating 1,000 years of glorious Russian history. Okay, so they're talking about their common history. And below you're seeing Georgia and how Christianity is a central tenet or central marker for the Georgian national ethos. Okay, so here we're looking at something interesting. We're looking at two ethno-national states. So what is ethno-nationalism? So first of all, the nation is defined as being from a very specific ethnicity. We're Germans, we're Poles, we're Irish, okay? We have a shared heritage. We have a shared culture. We have a common language. In some cases of ethno-nationalism, not all of them, we have a common faith. So for example, if German nationalism is a kind of ethno-nationalism, they don't have a common faith, meaning that let's remember that the Protestant Reformation emerged in Germany. So you have German Catholics, you have German Lutheran Protestants. So Christianity may be the common denominator, but as you're well aware, well, you should be aware, Catholics and Lutherans certainly don't see eye to eye, and certainly they wouldn't call that a shared faith or religion. They see themselves as two different religions. To a certain extent, I want to overstate the case, but shared traditions and history, okay, a common ethnic ancestry, okay, and finally, in some of these, there's also a geographic map of where this ethnos or ethnic group emerged as a national group. Why do I say sometimes? Because the exception, a very, very clear exception to this, is German nationalism. The Germans are all over the place, or ethnic Germans were all over the map. And think about it, okay? Later on, you had Austria emerging next to Germany. I mean, without getting, under Austrian skin or anything, they're ethnic Germans, okay? You had a lot of ethnic Germans in Czechoslovakia that emerged. There were ethnic Germans in Hungary. There were ethnic Germans in Poland, in Russia. I mean, there were ethnic Germans all over the place, which is one of Hitler's excuses for, gobbling, one of his excuses in terms of international arena when he was trying to make excuses the very early, very beginning, to gobble up because he wants to bring these ethnic Germans back into into Germany, what have you. So geography very often plays a part here, but not necessarily. Okay, but the rest do. If you take a look at this list, ladies and gentlemen, it's very interesting. If a nationalism is based on a shared heritage, okay, and a shared faith, and shared traditions and history, and a common ethnic ancestry, and you're a Jew, and you're living in one of the countries where their type of nationalism is an ethno-nationalism, can you be part of that nationalism? The answer is you can't, okay, because you don't have a shared heritage, because the Jews, from a Jewish perspective and a non-Jewish perspective, are from here, from the land of Israel. I'm sitting, not from there in Europe, okay, or other places. It's not a shared faith. Judaism is not the same as Christianity. Judaism is not the same as Islam, okay? Not shared history and not shared ethnic ancestry, okay? Meaning that countries that, or national movements that defined themselves in this way and had lots of Jews, or had some Jews living there, and not just Jews. I'm focusing on Jews now because it's part of our story to understand the rise of Jewish nationalism. But we could talk about other ethnic groups or religious groups that were also next to Jews but didn't fit into this rubric. They found themselves out, okay, unless those countries emerged as democracies and then said, wait a second, we have to make space for other groups that are not with the shared heritage and the shared language and the shared history and so on and so forth. Okay, so this is also interesting to take a look at. So having just laid this on the table for several moments, before we talk about the absolute, we'll start off with this. We'll start off with Napoleon. Look, first of all, we have two major revolutions at the end of the 18th century, which are creating themselves as nation states, as civic or liberal nation states. We have the earlier one, which is the American Revolution. And we have the next one following its footsteps, which is the French Revolution, which also faltered, collapsed, and had to regroup. And part of that faltering and regrouping related to the rise of Napoleon becoming an emperor and just waging war, 15 years plus, upwards of 15 years, and gobbling up parts of Europe. And the reason I put this map in front of you to the right is I'd like you to take a look at all these countries that Napoleon is going to be conquering, capturing, or controlling, because Napoleon does something very interesting. He is going to be basically foistering the ideals of the French Revolution onto these countries in order to undermine their traditional leadership. But at the same time, his French soldiers who are occupying these countries are abusive of the locals. And what happens is you're going to have the emergence of nationalism within what today is Germany, but then was many tens of different principalities, okay, plus Prussia, okay, and in Italy, and in various parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire that he captured, and so on and so forth. Every place that he captured, and he starts to, free people from the yoke of from their previous rulers, and tries to apply French ideals to them, and their soldiers are abusive. In all these places, you can have the emergence of a local nationalism, okay, as a response to Napoleon. This is important because this is what really spurs national movements in a big way, okay, in Europe, and it forces different groups to try to define themselves, who they are, okay, and therefore many of these countries, not all, but many of these peoples and countries that will be conquered by Napoleon are actually going to go down the route of ethno-nationalism rather than civic nationalism. Having said that, at this very moment, we need to have to stop and take a look, okay, at the situation of the Jews at this critical moment. Let me explain, ladies and gentlemen. And this is something that's very, very important for us to understand. And you're going to have to accept it as is, even if you inherently rebel against what I'm going to say. Up until 250 years ago, Jews who were living in Europe and Jews who were living in most of the Middle East identified themselves as a separate nation living as a minority nation within a majority country, and the majority rulers perceived the Jews as a separate nation. This, by the way, was reflected in law, meaning coming down almost the end of the 18th century, in Christian canon law in Europe, Jews, by virtue of the fact they were Jews and not Christians, could in no way participate in any kind of political activity, could not participate in any kind of educational activity if there was such, and they couldn't purchase land and own land, and they were locked out of many of the professions by law, and in some cases were also restricted in terms of their movement. This is the case of virtually all Jews, okay, in Europe up to the end of the 18th century. And this meant, by the way, that the Jews perceived themselves as a separate nation, and we see it reflected very interesting way religiously in writings that we have of Jews from Europe. So there is a very famous diary from the 17th century of a very articulate literary Jewish woman whose name was Gluckl of Hamelin, who wrote an incredible diary. She was a businesswoman, very, very interesting woman. And you read the diary and constantly saying, we are in exile. She's living, she was born, in Germany. We're in exile because of our iniquities, because of our sins. Exile meaning from the land of Israel. And when God is ready, he'll bring us back. Right? Brings a Messiah and we'll come back. No, it's the main mindset of the Jews who were living in Europe. And by the way, in the Middle East, okay, up until 250 years ago, was that we're a nation in exile. Our homeland is in the Middle East, in the land of Israel. And when God's ready, he'll bring us back. We're here because of our sins. Okay, but the Jews' self-identity and self-perception was they were a nation. And the perception of the majority cultures that they lived among also saw the Jews as something separate and not part of them. By the way, in most cases, the Jews also spoke a completely different language than the majority culture, and in many cases didn't even know the language of the majority culture. So this is the situation on the eve of Napoleon's conquests. And this now brings us to Napoleon, and you'll understand why. Because things are going to break down for the Jews. When I say break down, they're going to change dramatically. They're going to change dramatically because of what's going to happen with Napoleon. Ladies and gentlemen, in 1806, Napoleon convenes in France a Jewish judiciary. In Jewish history, it's called the Sanhedrin, but he's gonna basically convene Jewish leaders. He's going to send them a list of questions. And I'm going to paraphrase the questions for you. Who are you people? Are you French or are you Jews? Whose law code are you going to follow? My Napoleonic law code or your Jewish law code? What happens if there's a conflict in your Jewish law code and my Napoleonic code? Which one are you going to follow? If I go to war with Great Britain, are you going to serve my army and fight against your co-religionists who might be serving the British army? Who are you people? Where are your loyalties? Are you French or are you not French? This, by the way, was a shocking jolt for the Jews because the Jews had not been asked these questions, or didn't have to ask questions for about 1,500 years, for the moment they lost their Roman citizenship, when the Roman Empire became Christianized. And essentially, the answer that they came back to him with about 4 or 5 years later was an answer that Jews had never given in their history. The answer that the French Jews give to Napoleon is the following. Again, I'm paraphrasing. You can, by the way, do a Google search, Napoleon's questions to the Jews, the Sanhedrin, and the Jewish response. Okay, you can find, but I'm paraphrasing, I'm giving you the essence. The Jews say, we are Frenchmen of the Mosaic faith. In other words, our nationality is that we're French, our faith, what we do in our homes, our Jewish practices are our faith, but that is in no way conflicting with our French nationalism. Jews had never given this kind of response before. And what's going to happen is, as Napoleon conquers that territory we looked at before, he's going to emancipate the Jews in all those places that he conquers. When he's pushed out, those countries are going to try to close the door again on the Jews, but they don't shut it the whole way. The door's been jolted open, even if it's slightly, and this is going to be opening more and more. And basically, this is going to enable Jews in Western and Central Europe to begin to be emancipated and to begin to enter the mainstreams of their society as citizens. Now, this is important because what I've just to encapsulate in 30 seconds, what I've told you is that up to 250 years, Jews were a nation in a national sense. And starting from the French Revolution and the American Revolution forward, Jews now began to redefine themselves, okay, nationally, okay, as citizens of the country they lived in, where those countries would embrace them and allow them to do that, okay, and their religious faith became their ethnic marker and not their national identity, okay? And this is important for the following reason. Those people, nations who oppose the very concept of the Jewish state of Israel, their primary claim, their first primary claim is Jews are not a nation, you're a religion, okay? And we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but you need to understand that for sure, up to 250 years ago, Jews self-perceived and were perceived by all the surrounding non-Jewish environment as a nation in the national sense, okay? And this begins to break down, okay, going from Napoleon forward. Just because of our time, I want to move forward, and I want to also give you guys an opportunity to ask questions. So, what exactly is Jewish nationalism? The term is Zionism. That's the term for the Jewish national movement. Zion is an alternative name or nickname for the land of Israel or Jerusalem. We find it multiple times in the Bible being used that way. So, first of all, let's talk about why some Jews began to redefine themselves or define themselves once again in a national sense, not a religious sense. Okay, so, and I'm doing this quite briefly, and of course, when you ask questions, I'll be happy to elaborate. The first thing is that some of the countries that promised emancipation didn't live up to the promise, and other countries that never made the promise, but Jews knew about the fact that their co-religionists in other countries were being assimilated into society. This caused them to leave those countries or to search for something else. This is number one. Number two, the emancipation of the Jews and turning them into citizens also, because part of the Enlightenment was also to disseminate education and free education. Jews now allowed to go to schools, were now allowed to go to universities, and there was a price. It was a price in a religious sense because there were exams on the Sabbath, and if you went away to university, how do you eat in the canteen? It's not kosher food. The Jews had to, if they wanted to enter to the front door, they had to discard some of their practices. And this caused a crisis in Judaism, which I don't want to go into this right now. The only reason I'm mentioning it is that Zionism saw itself as an antidote also for the crisis in Judaism. Okay, and it's not essentially enough to our story for me to go into depth. If people have questions about it, I'll be happy to answer in the Q&A. Okay, those national movements, particularly in what used to be called Yugoslavia, in the Balkans, okay, in some of them, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a lot of the national movements were ethno-national movements that Jews simply were not allowed to participate in, even if they wanted to. They were not allowed to participate in them, and they couldn't. So they were not accepted in those national movements, and so some Jews left those territories to look for greener pastures, like in the United States or in Britain or Canada or what have you. Okay, or they began looking towards their own, re-identifying themselves nationally. Jewish identity began to break down under this crisis of Judaism, and one of the answers of Jewish identity was a national one. And finally, and please note, I'm putting this as the final one, is anti-Semitism. Because you had anti-Semitism in the 18th century, but you had no rise of the Zionist movement. You had, one of the worst centuries for Jews, okay, in modern times, okay, if you're not aware of this, of course, is going to be the 17th century. The Chmielnicki massacre is a terrible century for Jews. It was anti-Semitism, but it didn't cause the rise of a national movement. So anti-Semitism doesn't stand on its own as a cause. Okay, so you have to be very cautious and careful about that. Without the idea of nationalism, that was not a Jewish idea. Okay, without the idea of nationalism that was spreading like wildfire all through Europe and was influencing the Jews, you would not have had the rise of a Jewish national movement. Anti-Semitism was definitely a catalyst, okay, and an accelerator, okay, for some Jews to turn to Jewish national Zionism. For many others, it meant to go to America or go to North America and South America and so on and so forth. So how do we define this Jewish nationalism? What is Zionism exactly? Okay, it is a political movement. That's obvious to all of you because it's a political movement that wants to create a nation state, but it's also a cultural movement. And that's something I think many of you may not be aware of. It's a cultural movement because Zionism also wanted to reinvigorate Jewish identity and Jews on a cultural and spiritual level as well. So it's not just a political movement, okay? And the three most primary goals or concepts of Zionism were, number one, Jews, ladies and gentlemen, constitute a national group, not just a religious affiliation. So I had to beat you on the head of this because it's very important. Number two, that because Jews are a national group, like others, Jews also have natural rights to self-determination. They have a right to rule themselves, okay? And finally, they should be allowed to rule themselves, to be sovereign in their ancient homeland, which is the land of Israel, which now they're calling Palestine. Okay, these are the three main tenets, okay, or concepts standing behind the Zionist movement. This, of course, raises a very important question because we said from the get-go that we're talking about two conflicting national movements or two conflicting nations that are fighting over the same territory. Before we even start talking about Palestinian nationalism, we have to raise a question about Arab nationalism. Here, ladies and gentlemen, it's very important for me to say the following. Look, the Zionist narrative has been, up until relatively recently, that Palestinian nationalism is a direct result of Zionism, okay, and did not really look seriously at a general Arab nationalism. But folks, Arab nationalism emerged in the late 19th century, okay, as a force of its own, for reasons actually quite different from the rise of Jewish nationalism. So, first of all, we have to keep in mind that virtually all the Arab countries, for a very long time, not all, but most of them, were living under an Ottoman Turkish, albeit Islamic, empire, okay? That humiliated the Arabs. So as the Ottoman Empire went into deep decline in the 19th century, the Arabs began to lift their heads up. This is number one. Number two, the fact that some modern technologies permeated and penetrated via the Ottoman Empire into the Middle East, including the printing press, caused a revival of the Arab language. And here's something that I think that I can't understate the importance of language as a promoter of national identity. It was in one of those within our ethnic nationalism. I mentioned it, but here I want to broaden the canvas. One of the main components of ethno-nationalism, for sure, is a common language, and therefore there's a big emphasis on folklore, on literature, on plays, on musicals. I mean, this is a big deal in ethno-national movements. We saw it in Germany, the Zionist movement, big time, put an emphasis on language. That's the revival, the renaissance of the Hebrew language, take an ancient tongue and making it a modern language. So what I'm saying to you folks is that there was also a revival of Arabic as a literary language, okay, with the introduction of the printing press among the intellectual classes of the Arabs. And they weren't large, but they existed, okay? And some of the Arab intellectuals also studied in Paris. They started studying in Europe, and they came back with ideas of nationalism from Europe, and they brought them back to the Middle East, okay? The technology that they encountered and the fact that the Ottoman Empire was shrinking and was in such a quick decline in the 19th century gave them a sense of just how backward the empire they're living in was, how Islamic civilization that had been so grand 1,000 years before that and had been actually superior to European civilization 500 years before that, was so inferior at this point. And there was a sense of humiliation and a desire to look back into a glorious Arab and Islamic past and to have a rebirth of that. And finally, this is important because I think many of you may not be aware of this, North Africa was already wrested away from Ottoman control by the French and certainly the British. British ruled in Egypt already from 1881. And the French already were very active in Lebanon. So there's also a sense of colonization and looking for a local identity to push back from what was perceived as Western imperialism. All these are giving us the cause of general Arab nationalism. Now, one of the most important aspects of our story here is one of two big bangs. I'm only going to reference one today, which reshuffled the deck and enabled and facilitated and expedited the conflict. The first big bang is World War I. Okay, because what happens during World War I? What happens during World War I, ladies and gentlemen, is that the British, while they're losing the war, by the way, okay, are going to start to divide up the spoils of war of the Ottoman Empire. And what they're going to end up doing, which is quite remarkable, is they're going to, in 3 consecutive years, make 3 different promises to different parties, which wholly or partially conflict with each other, and they start to plant the seeds of conflict in the region. The first one is what's known as the McMahon-Hussein correspondence. McMahon was the High Commissioner of Egypt, the British High Commissioner of Egypt. Hussein was he was a sheikh who ruled Mecca, okay, the most important Islamic sites in the world, in what today is Saudi Arabia. And they have this correspondence because McMahon is trying to get this Hussein to bring Arabs to fight on the British side to undermine the Ottoman control. They're basically trying to create an Ottoman revolt. An Arab revolt. Of course, you're familiar with Lawrence of Arabia. That's the story of Lawrence of Arabia. He's the middleman, but McMahon is the chief political person on the British side. And in this correspondence, the British are going to be promising lots and lots of territory for a big Arab empire to Hussein and his kids. The thing is that they were a bit vague on the details, and each side of this correspondence understood what they were giving and getting differently. The map you have in front of you is the way the British viewed it. They were going to be giving basically the Arabs from what today is Saudi Arabia, most of the Middle East, what would encompass today Syria, a little bit of Lebanon, okay, part of Jordan, or a large part of Jordan, I should say, Iraq, okay, and what Hussein understood was it would also include all of Lebanon and all of what today is Israel, okay, and so on and so forth. So they understood different things. This correspondence is going to be taking place between 1915 and 1916. But lo and behold, in 1916, 2 diplomats, a French diplomat called Picot and a British diplomat called Sykes, will be sitting down in 1916, and they will be dividing up. Again, they're not winning the war in 1916. This is what you call chutzpah in French. Okay, they're dividing up the spoils of war that they're losing at that point. They had a lot of temerity to think they'd win. They did win at the end of the day, and essentially they divided the whole area into zones of influence. So you take a look on the left-hand side. You can see here that the British were going to be controlling directly much of what is Iraq. They would be controlling to a large degree also much of what was going to be Jordan. The French were going to be directly controlling parts of Asia Minor, Turkey today, and parts of Syria and all of Lebanon. And they would be, the lion's share of Syria would be under French influence. And please note, the land of Israel would be an international zone where both the French and the British would be kind of running the show together. This is what the big picture on the left. on the right-hand side, you see a kind of a zoom in of what this is supposed to look like, okay, specifically in our area. This, of course, completely contradicts the McMahon-Hussein correspondence. It makes it completely irrelevant, because the wording of the correspondence is talking about sovereignty. It's not talking about, you know, a protectorate and that kind of stuff. So this is great because in 1917 we have the famous Balfour Declaration, and we take a look at the Balfour Declaration. We're gonna look at it under a microscope in a moment. We have the two gentlemen here, Lord Balfour, who was he's the Minister of Foreign Affairs, okay, on the left, and we have Baron, you know, Rothschild, who was an eminent British Jew who was involved in the Zionist movement. He's asked to pass this letter on to the Zionist leaders in the UK at the time. This is, by the way, it's not just a letter. This is a declaration of policy. This is an official British declaration of policy. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's take a closer look at what the British say here. I'll read it to you, with your permission. His Majesty's government view with favor, I have no idea what that means. I view with favor having some ice cream after we finish this session. The establishment in Palestine, not all of Palestine, in Palestine, of a national home. By the way, I have no idea what a national home means here, for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Read that as the Arabs, who are the majority, or, this is the great part, guys, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. Guess who had those last two sentences added into the declaration? Anti-Zionist British Jews, who did not want to lose their rights as British Jews, were afraid they'd be accused of dual loyalty. Of course, these are things that we are so familiar with. I'm sorry about the phone in the background. I can't do anything about it. Hope it's not too disruptive. But this is something that the British Jews who were not for Zionism demanded was placed in here in order to protect their status, which means that something that's very important to understand is that many Jews, if not most Jews, were not on board with the Zionist movement. I'm going to stop here. Well, I'm going to stop in a second, really in a second, with our last slide here. Our last slide is showing us General Allenby as he enters the Jaffa Gate to receive the surrender of Jerusalem in December 1917, which is 1 month after the Balfour Declaration. He hasn't conquered all of Palestine, but he's conquered much of it. And within less than a year, they will succeed in vanquishing the Ottoman Turks from Palestine. This begins British rule. What we have not yet addressed is the Palestinian National Movement, because to you, me, and a lamppost, it doesn't exist yet. It'll exist only starting from 1920, and right now we're stopping in 1917. I promised myself and Ellen I was going to start for 45 minutes, and I've spoken for 56 minutes. I will get better. I'm going to try to keep these sessions down. I'm sharing them. I'm going to try to keep them down to 45 minutes in order to make it more palatable for all of you and to give you time, but you'll still have as much time as you need right now for Q&A. So I want to thank everybody who didn't snore. Actually, you're all muted. Go ahead. You guys haven't sent me too much in the chat, but let's see what we have here. Okay. So I'm being asked a question about Napoleon's questions, were they considered binding? You know, it's a very good question. Napoleon evidently he had a grand strategy of trying to get Jews, not just in France, but Jews in general on board, because that's why he emancipates Jews every place that he conquers. He may have had a kind of philo-Semitic or anti-Semitic concept that the Jews have more power than they actually do, and they had, of course, very little power at the time, or had lots of money, which they didn't have most Jews at the time as well. But be that as it may, when the emperor calls you to convene, okay, and issues you these questions, you want to think very carefully of what the ramifications are if I don't answer the right way, if we don't answer the correct way. So, you know, this is not a democracy. This is an empire. This is the Emperor Napoleon, who is putting the questions. So when the emperor puts down questions, I would think that the answers would be binding. That's my gut feeling. Nobody else has asked any questions. So everything's clear, or everybody's bored out of their minds. We haven't had too much conflict yet, except people fighting during World War I. And I'm sorry about that. I know you want some blood and guts, but we're going to get to it in our next session. But in order for us to really jump into this conflict, we need to understand what the roots are. And the roots are a national conflict. Okay, and we need to understand why Jews would be even thinking about a national identity, and why the Palestinians might be thinking about a national identity. I will say one thing right now, and that is that when we look at Arab nationalism as it emerges in the 19th century, they had a pan-Arabic view. It wasn't so much Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, but this kind of ethno-nationalism that saw the Arabs at large, whether they were Christians or Muslims, as being part of the same ethnos or group or national group. And they strove for example, what they called a greater Syria. And a greater Syria would include what today would include parts of Iraq, all of Syria, all of Lebanon, all of Jordan, all of Israel. Okay, so you have to understand that that was part of their national goals or aims. At the same time, you also had a pan-Islamic kind of a nationalism, which said, which obviously excluded Christian Arabs, but was looking at as kind of an Arab Islamic, a pan-Arab Islamic viewpoint, which is saying, look, the Ottoman Turks, they're not Arabs, they're Muslims, okay, and they're in decline, they're being defeated. We need to lift ourselves up and have an Islamic caliphate. And please don't take this the wrong way, folks. They're not talking about ISIS, not talking about all the crazy shenanigans we've had in the last 20 years. We're talking here about something that will replace the Ottoman Empire, okay, which would have Islamic law and Islamic rule, but it would be Arabs doing it and not the Turks. Okay, and this is also going to emerge. We have a question coming up. Okay, so a very good question about the Kurds. So clearly the Kurds, okay, their national aspirations are also going to rise in the 19th century when you have nationalism, and it's going to be an ethno-nationalism with the Kurds. Initially, the Kurds, Muslims, but not all of them. Actually, I shouldn't say it. Let's start over again. The Kurds have a common language, that's for sure. They're all over the place in terms of territory. Okay, we find lots of Kurds, in Turkey, in northern Syria, in Iraq, in Iran. They're really in a large swath of the Middle East, and they're actually mostly Muslims, but there are also Christian Kurds. There are Jewish Kurds, okay, and there are Shiite Kurds and Sunni Kurds. So they're kind of all over the place in terms of their religious affiliation. Their common denominator has been that because they're not Arabs, and Arabic is not their language. They're not Arabs, and Arabic is not their language. It's a Kurdish language. They also found themselves persecuted, maybe the wrong term, but let's say as second-class citizens very often, certainly if under the Turks or later on under Arab regimes. What's interesting is that the Kurdish nationalism actually has developed into something that's closer to a civic nationalism. I'll tell you a neat story if you don't mind. Went with my family for Sukkot 2 years ago to Sweden, of all places. Why? Because to Stockholm. Why? Because it was the cheapest flights we found. So we get at the airport, we get into a taxi, and I'm sitting in the front, and my wife and the girls are sitting in the back of the taxi, and I look at his license, and it's Muhammad something, and so I immediately, and yeah, it's Muhammad, and it had like his name, the rest of his name sounded to me looked like something like, it wasn't an Arab name, it was something a little bit Turkish to me, and so I immediately said to my wife and kids in English, in Spanish or English only, please. Don't use Hebrew here. And so they were talking up and back, and they kept going back and forth in Spanish and English. Don't ask me why. I'm not going to go into that right now. Those who know me know why. And at some point, the driver says, "Where where are you from? Like he was trying to figure out where we were from because he was doing Spanish and English. And I said, we're from Jerusalem. He goes, Jerusalem. Oh, you're from Israel. And I looked at him and I said, yes, we're from Israel. And he said, oh, we like you. I said, he goes, that's not my name. Muhammad's not my name. I said, oh, really? He goes, I'm a Kurd. He goes, I'm a Kurd. This is not my name. I'm not a Muslim. He goes, I'm a Kurd. We love you guys. Okay, that's interesting. So we had a really nice conversation, and it's like he took pains when we got us to the hotel to get out of the car, opened his wallet, took out his driver's license, and in fact, there was no Muhammad on his driver's license. He erased the name off his driver's license. Very interesting. He didn't want that identity, and he said, "Listen, we're 50,000 Kurds here in Sweden. We have a good life here. We don't any of this. We don't want any of this Middle Eastern stuff over here with the conflict. We don't want this here. And we love the Israelis." Okay, I'm not finished yet. So when we go back to the airport after 10 days from Stockholm, we get into a cab, and here we go again. I look at the license, and it wasn't Muhammad, but it was also and he's like, "Where are you guys from?" I said, "We're from Israel." He goes, "Oh," he goes, "I'm an Iranian Kurd." I'm an Iranian Shiite Kurd. So wow, that's interesting. I didn't realize they were Kurdish Shiites. He goes, "Yeah," and I have this conversation. He goes, "We really love you guys." I said, I have friends in Israel who were they're Kurds. They're Kurds. Like they as Israeli Kurds. They'd be really ticked. He says to me, "Listen," he goes, "Sunnis, Shiites, Jews, Christians, doesn't matter. We're all Kurds." And I thought that was very interesting. Okay, so it was a long story, and maybe you didn't like the punchline, but there was another question here. So, what is wasn't this considered the Levant? Yes, the area we're talking about here is Levant. What is the history of the words Palestine and Palestinian? Okay, we'll do a quick one on Palestine and Palestinian. The term Palestine is a term that emerges as an official term already under the Emperor Hadrian, particularly when he's going to suppress the second Jewish revolt against the Romans, which takes place between 132 and 135 CE or AD. It's a terrible revolt, cost a lot of Jewish lives and a lot of Roman lives as well. And as a result of this, Hadrian changed the name of the province from the province of Judea to the province of Syria, Palestina. He's the one who gives the official name. Evidently, though, it was a name that was bantered around before his time. He didn't pluck it out of nowhere, but it was not the common name that was used by most people, and it was kind of a corruption of Philistines, which didn't exist as an ethnic group anymore at that time. That's regarding, and the name stuck. The name simply stuck from 135 CE or AD until today. In terms of Palestinian, that's a very good question, and there's a very good answer. It starts with the British Mandate of Palestine, because there's no definition of Palestine before then. We actually have a proper, quote unquote, proper definition of what Palestine is with the British Mandate, which we're going to talk about in our next session. And all the people living in British Mandate Palestine who were not British were Palestinians. It means they were Palestinian Jews and the Palestinian Arabs. Okay? After the emergence of, after the emergence of the state of Israel, Palestinian then denoted Palestinian Arabs. Okay, folks, I want to thank you for staying here with me, and only a few of you have divested yourselves from me, which is a good thing. Try to come up with more questions next time, make it more interesting for you. We're going to be sending out a bibliography, suggested readings. You can have a general one and also kind of like a session by session one, which of course is not obligatory, but I think you'll find it to be enriching. So let me wish everybody, all of you, a lot of good health. Please protect yourselves from this pandemic. And those of you who it's important for them, I'd like to wish you an easy fast for those who are fasting, and for those who it's important for you and believe in it, may be written in the book of life. And happy high holidays, Chag Sameach, for those who it's relevant. Cheers.
Thank you, Avi, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Again, this is the first in a series, a 10-part series. Our next session will be held October 10th at 2 p.m. That session, as Avi mentioned, will focus in on the British Mandate period, 1922 to 1948. We look forward to seeing you all soon. We have many engaging programs and events planned for the fall. We hope you'll join us tomorrow for Jonty's virtual tour of Israel, featuring Israel as a startup nation. And on Tuesday, we will see Avi again for his monthly update on Israel. And then on Thursday, September 23rd, we'll begin our new series on Holocaust museums and memorials around the world. To sign up for these programs and more, please visit our event page on our website, classroomswithoutborders.org/events. Stay safe, stay healthy, Gamato.